The greatest threat to Rome was not an invading army or a natural disaster, but rather a series of bad decisions made by Roman leaders that ultimately led to the destruction of their own city. The year is 218 BC, and Rome has found itself in a dire situation. They are in the middle of a war with Carthage, a powerful North African empire that had grown in power and influence over the previous 2 centuries. The Romans had already suffered 2 humiliating defeats at the hands of the Carthaginians, losing thousands of men in the process. And to make matters worse, the Carthaginians were led by one of the greatest military commanders in history, Hannibal Barca. He was a genius tactician who had studied the Romans extensively and knew how to exploit their weaknesses. But it was another Carthaginian general named Hannibal Barca who truly terrified the Romans. You see, Hasdrubal was Hannibal's older brother, and he was leading a massive Carthaginian army in the west, aiming to capture the province of Hispania from the Romans. If Hasdrubal succeeded, he would open up a second front in the war, forcing the Romans to fight a war on 2 fronts against the Carthaginians. And if that wasn't bad enough, Hasdrubal also planned to march his army into Italy and join forces with Hannibal there. That would have given Hannibal close to 100,000 soldiers, and together they could have easily overrun Italy and destroyed Rome. Luckily for the Romans, Hasdrubal never got the chance to do this. He met his match in a young and ambitious Roman general named Publius Cornelius Scipio, who managed to defeat Hasdrubal's army and kill him in battle. This victory bought some time for the Romans and allowed them to regroup and come up with a plan to finally defeat Hannibal. After much debate, the Roman Senate decided to take a risk. They appointed Scipio as the new commander of the Roman forces in Spain, and gave him the task of invading Africa itself. It was a bold move, but it was the only option left for Rome. If they couldn't defeat Hannibal in Italy, then they would have to take the fight to his home turf. Scipio wasted no time in launching his invasion. He assembled an army of 70,000 men and sailed across the Mediterranean Sea to the North African coast. His goal was to capture the Carthaginian capital of Carthage and bring an end to the war once and for all. But Scipio had no idea what he was getting himself into. Carthage was a formidable city. It was surrounded by high walls that had never been breached before and was heavily defended by Carthaginian soldiers. To make matters worse, Hannibal was a genius strategist, and he had prepared for Rome's invasion of Africa. He had placed traps and ambushes all over the countryside, and his soldiers were masters of guerrilla warfare. They would attack the Romans when they least expected it, and then retreat into the safety of the city walls. Despite these setbacks, Scipio pressed on. He laid siege to Carthage for 3 years, but the city just wouldn't fall. The Romans were suffering heavy losses, and morale was beginning to dwindle. It looked like the war would drag on for many more years to come. But then something unexpected happened. A group of Carthaginian nobles known as the Zalmamites approached Scipio and offered to surrender the city if he agreed to spare its people. It was a bold move, but it paid off. Scipio accepted the offer, and Carthage was captured. It seemed like the war was finally over, but Hannibal was nowhere to be found. You see, Hannibal had fled to the hills with a small group of soldiers and had been waging a guerrilla war against the Romans ever since. But now that Carthage was captured, Hannibal's position was precarious. He was isolated and surrounded by Roman soldiers, and to make matters worse, he was slowly losing his mind. You see, Hannibal had been under enormous pressure for years. He had the weight of an entire empire on his shoulders, and the stress was taking its toll on him. He began to make reckless decisions, and his health started to deteriorate. In fact, some historians believe that Hannibal may have suffered from a mental breakdown in the final days of the war. Whatever the case, Hannibal's army was eventually surrounded and defeated by Roman soldiers, and Hannibal himself was forced to flee to the city of Bages, where he took his own life rather than surrender to the Romans. And with that, the Second Punic War came to an end. Rome had emerged victorious, but at a great cost. The war had devastated the Italian peninsula, and the Roman treasury was nearly bankrupt. But despite the cost, the Romans were ecstatic. They had defeated Hannibal and Carthage, and their dominance in the Mediterranean was now unchallenged. In fact, the Romans were so proud of their victory that they built monuments and statues to commemorate it. One of the most famous of these monuments is the Arch of Titus, which was built in 81 AD to celebrate the Roman victory. The arch is decorated with sculptures depicting the sack of Carthage, including scenes of Hannibal's elephants being captured and put to work in the Roman mines. But while Rome was celebrating, the seeds of their own destruction were already being planted. You see, after the war, the Roman Senate began to take control of the former Carthaginian territories. They imposed harsh taxes on the people and exploited the land for its resources. The Carthaginians had already suffered greatly during the war, and now they were being punished even further. This resentment would eventually boil over and lead to a third war between Rome and Carthage. But that's not where the story ends. After the Third Punic War, Rome completely destroyed Carthage, killing or enslaving most of its people and burning its great library to the ground. The Romans had finally crushed their greatest rival, but they had also destroyed themselves in the process. The war had lasted for 146 years and had taken the lives of millions of people. Rome was now in complete control of the Mediterranean, but their empire was on the brink of collapse. The people were divided, and the economy was in shambles. In fact, some historians believe that the destruction of Carthage was a major contributing factor to Rome's downfall, and it's easy to see why. The Carthaginians had been Rome's greatest challenge, and by defeating them, Rome had lost their greatest rival. The Romans now had no one to fight, and so they turned on each other. Civil wars and political instability became commonplace, and the once mighty Roman Empire was eventually overrun by barbarian tribes. So in a strange twist of fate, the destruction of Carthage actually ended up destroying Rome as well. But that's not where the story ends. Rome would eventually rise again from the ashes and become the dominant power in Europe. But their second chance didn't last forever. The Roman Empire would eventually collapse again, and this time, there would be no coming back. The Western Roman Empire would fall in for 76 AD, and the Eastern Roman Empire would follow suit in 1453 AD. But the story doesn't end there. The legacy of Rome would live on in the cultures and traditions of Europe for centuries to come. Their art and architecture would inspire generations of Europeans, and their ideas about government and law would shape the modern world. So even though Rome eventually fell, their impact on human history cannot be denied. But that's not where the story ends. Rome's story is still being written today. The ruins of ancient Rome are some of the most popular tourist destinations in the world, and the Roman language, Latin, is still spoken by millions of people. So while the Roman Empire may have fallen, the Roman legacy lives on. It is a legacy of war and conquest, but also of art and culture. The Romans were a complex and fascinating people, and their story is one that is still being uncovered by archaeologists and historians today. So, while the Roman Empire may have fallen, the Roman legacy lives on. So, what do you think? Do you agree that Rome's destruction of Carthage was their greatest mistake? Or do you think they made the right call? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more epic stories from history.